In 1941, if you were an American infantryman and you heard the sound of tank tracks grinding toward you, there was a simple, terrifying truth. You had no reliable way to stop it. The United States Army entered the Second World War with courage, manpower, and growing industrial strength, but at the squad level, it had zero effective portable anti-tank weapons, no shoulder-fired rockets, no disposable launchers, no lightweight shaped charge systems. If a German armored vehicle appeared over a ridge, the average rifle squad had little more than bolt-action rifles, Browning automatic rifles, and hand grenades. None of them could penetrate the frontal armor of a modern German tank. In theory, infantry were supported by towed anti-tank guns. The 37mm M3 gun was the standard American answer to enemy armor in the early war years. On paper, it looked adequate. In practice, it was outmatched almost as soon as it met German steel in North Africa. Against early Panzer models, it struggled. Against improved variants with thicker armor, it became almost symbolic. German crews reportedly nicknamed it the door knocker because rounds would bounce off, announcing American presence without doing serious damage. And that was the best dedicated anti-tank weapon available to many U.S. units in 1941 and early 1942. Meanwhile, German doctrine had been refined in the crucible of Poland and France. Blitzkrieg was not just about tanks, it was about speed, shock, and coordinated violence. Armor punched through weak points, mechanized infantry followed, artillery and aircraft suppressed resistance. The psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. When German panzers broke through a line, they did not politely engage, they rolled past, cut supply routes, and shattered cohesion. By late 1942, American forces were about to face this system directly. Operation Torch put U.S. troops into North Africa. Many of them were inexperienced. They had trained hard, but training ranges in the United States did not replicate the sudden appearance of German armor cresting a desert ridge. The first serious encounters revealed a brutal imbalance. German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, supported by seasoned crews and coordinated anti-tank screens, maneuvered with confidence. American infantry often found themselves pinned, flanked, or overrun. Then came February 1943. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, German forces under experienced commanders launched a concentrated offensive against American positions. The terrain channeled movement through mountain passes and narrow approaches. It was the kind of ground where armored thrusts could create panic if defenders were unprepared. They were unprepared. German tanks advanced with artillery support and aggressive reconnaissance. American units, lacking cohesive command and effective anti-tank coordination, struggled to respond. Towed guns were knocked out, abandoned, or bypassed. Once a 37mm gun revealed its position by firing, it became a priority target. German crews understood exactly how to eliminate it: high explosive shells, machine gun fire, flanking maneuvers. For the infantrymen in a shallow foxhole, the experience was visceral. The rumble came first, a low vibration in the ground. Then the silhouette of a tank appeared, steel tracks grinding, turret scanning. A rifle bullet would spark harmlessly against armor. A fragmentation grenade might explode against steel and do nothing more than scratch paint. Closing to within a few yards to attempt a desperate grenade attack meant exposing yourself to coaxial machine guns and supporting infantry. It meant betting your life on a throw. Some soldiers tried Molotov cocktails, some waited for side or rear shots, some simply withdrew because standing in place meant annihilation. The imbalance was not just technical, it was psychological. German tank crews believed in their armor. They had seen enemy lines collapse before. Speed and aggression were their weapons. When resistance seemed weak, they pressed harder. When anti-tank fire seemed ineffective, they advanced with confidence. American infantry felt that confidence bearing down on them.
Kasserine Pass became a hard lesson. Units were pushed back, equipment was lost, command structures faltered under pressure. German forces captured supplies, vehicles, and something else that would matter later. But in February 1943, the immediate reality was defeat. After-action reports from the campaign were blunt. American anti-tank capability at the small unit level was insufficient. Infantry needed a portable weapon, something that could be carried by 1 or 2 men, deployed quickly, and capable of penetrating tank armor without requiring a heavy gun crew and prime mover. Traditional anti-tank guns failed infantry units for several reasons. They were heavy and had to be towed into position. In fluid desert warfare, mobility mattered. If a gun could not be repositioned fast enough, it was outflanked. If it fired from a fixed spot, it drew immediate counterfire. And if the crew broke under pressure, the weapon was abandoned. Infantry needed autonomy. They needed the ability to turn any pile of rubble, any ditch or hedgerow, into a tank trap. But in early 1943, that capability did not yet exist in meaningful numbers. And there was another looming threat on the horizon: heavier German armor. The Tiger tank, with its thick frontal armor and powerful 88mm gun, represented a level of protection and firepower that rendered small-caliber anti-tank guns nearly obsolete at range. Even if Tigers were not present at every engagement, their reputation spread faster than their tracks. Rumors traveled through units quickly, stories of shells bouncing off armor, of tanks surviving multiple hits, of positions crushed beneath steel tracks. Whether every story was perfectly accurate didn't matter. Fear amplified them. Imagine being 19 years old, drafted, trained, shipped overseas. You dig into rocky ground under a North African sun. You hear engines in the distance. You know that your rifle cannot stop what is coming. You know that your grenade requires you to get dangerously close. You know that if the supporting anti-tank gun is destroyed, you are exposed. That knowledge changes how you fight. Desperation is not just a feeling, it is a strategic condition. When infantry cannot stop armor, armor dictates tempo. It chooses when to engage and when to bypass. It forces retreats. It fractures lines. It imposes fear as a weapon. By late 1942, American commanders understood something fundamental. Industrial capacity alone would not solve this immediate tactical crisis. Training improvements were essential, leadership reforms were necessary, but none of that would matter if the man in the foxhole still had no practical way to kill a tank. Somewhere, the solution would have to be simple, portable, cheap, mass-producible. A weapon that could be issued not to a specialized crew, but to ordinary infantry. Because until that happened, every rumble of tracks in the distance meant the same thing for an American rifle squad. Hold your ground and hope someone else has something that can stop it.
By the time the reports from North Africa reached Washington, the conclusion was unavoidable. American infantry needed a weapon that could travel with them, not behind them. Something light enough to carry, powerful enough to kill a tank, and simple enough to produce by the hundreds of thousands. The answer would not begin in a grand laboratory. It would begin with a problem, a theory, and a steel tube. The idea itself was not entirely new. The shaped charge principle had been understood in scientific circles for decades. When an explosive is formed around a hollow cavity, often cone-shaped, and detonated, the blast focuses into a narrow jet of superheated metal capable of penetrating armor far thicker than the projectile itself. It did not rely on velocity. It relied on chemistry and geometry. This changed everything. Traditional anti-tank guns depended on kinetic energy: bigger gun, higher velocity, thicker barrel, heavier carriage. The shaped charge ignored that logic. It meant a relatively slow projectile could burn through steel using explosive force alone.
In 1941 and early 1942, experiments were already underway within the U.S. Army's ordnance community. One of the most important figures was Lieutenant Edward Ull, an Army Reserve officer and engineer. Working alongside Captain Leslie Skinner at the Army's research facilities, Ull explored whether a small rocket could deliver a shaped charge warhead accurately enough to be useful on the battlefield. The concept was radical for American infantry doctrine. A rocket launcher that could be fired from the shoulder. No heavy carriage, no tow vehicle, just a tube, a trigger, and a projectile with enough explosive focus to burn through tank armor. The first prototype was astonishingly crude. A simple steel tube, wiring, basic ignition, improvised sights, early versions reportedly bent from wire. It did not look like a weapon that would change the course of mechanized warfare. It looked like something assembled from spare parts. But when tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground in May 1942, the results were undeniable. The rocket's shaped charge warhead punched through armor that conventional small-caliber rounds could not defeat. The launcher was light, recoilless in practical terms, operable by a two-man team. It did not require a truck. It did not require a gun crew of 5 or 6 men. It required training, but not artillery-level specialization. There were challenges. Early rockets were not perfectly reliable. Ignition systems had to be refined. Backblast was dangerous in confined spaces. Accuracy required practice. But these were engineering problems, not conceptual failures. The deeper breakthrough was cost. At roughly $25 per unit in wartime production, the launcher could be manufactured at a scale that heavy anti-tank guns never could. It was not a precision-machined artillery piece. It was a steel tube built for function over elegance. In a war increasingly defined by industrial output, that simplicity mattered. General Dwight Eisenhower would later rank the rocket launcher, soon nicknamed the Bazooka, as one of the 4 key tools for victory for Allied forces in Europe, alongside the atomic bomb, the Jeep, and the C-47 transport aircraft. That was not hyperbole. It reflected something fundamental. The weapon returned agency to the infantrymen. But in 1942, none of that prestige existed yet. What existed were urgent field reports and mounting pressure. North Africa had exposed the vulnerability. Production had to accelerate. Training had to catch up. And thousands of these launchers had to reach units before the next major confrontation with German armor. The bazooka's official designation became the M1 rocket launcher. The name bazooka reportedly came from its resemblance to a novelty musical instrument used by radio comedian Bob Burns. Soldiers saw the tube and the nickname stuck. It was an unassuming name for a weapon that could punch through several inches of steel. Mass production began. Factories turned out launchers and rockets in growing numbers. The math was brutal in its simplicity. If nearly 500,000 could be produced, then nearly 500,000 infantry squads could possess the ability to kill a tank. Against that scale, even heavily armored divisions faced a new kind of threat. Yet innovation always collides with reality. In one early logistical failure, thousands of rocket launchers were shipped overseas in sealed crates without adequate training materials. Units received the weapon, but not the knowledge. Some commanders hesitated to deploy them aggressively. Others misunderstood effective ranges. A revolutionary tool is only as effective as the soldier who understands it. But once training spread and doctrine adapted, the psychological equation began to shift. For the first time, a rifle squad could ambush armor from concealment, from rubble, from hedgerows, from upper floors of buildings. They did not need a prepared gun pit. They did not need to wait for artillery. They needed line of sight and nerve. The shaped charge did not care how thick the steel was in front of it. It did not bounce off like the 37mm door knocker. When it struck correctly, it burned through armor in a violent jet of molten metal, sending lethal fragments and spall into the crew compartment. Tank commanders began to learn that advancing past a pile of debris was no longer safe. Any broken wall might conceal a launcher. Any farmhouse window might flash with rocket fire. And here was the deeper strategic shift. Germany could copy the weapon. In fact, after capturing examples in North Africa, they would. But copying a design is not the same as matching industrial output. American factories were already scaling toward hundreds of thousands of units. The advantage was not just invention, it was production velocity. By late 1943 and into 1944, the bazooka was no longer experimental, it was standard. Infantry divisions expected it, airborne units trained with it, armored infantry carried it as insurance against counterattacks. The balance that had tilted so violently at Kasserine was beginning to move back. What had started as a steel tube experiment at Aberdeen Proving Ground was becoming a doctrine disruptor. Blitzkrieg relied on speed and shock. Shock required confidence. Confidence required armor superiority. And armor superiority depends on the belief that the enemy cannot easily kill you. The bazooka attacked that belief directly. It did not eliminate tanks, it did not make armor obsolete, but it forced German commanders to slow down, to reconnoiter more carefully, to respect infantry in ways they had not in 1940 or 1941. For the American soldier who had once watched rifle rounds spark uselessly against steel, this new weapon represented something more than technology. It meant that when the rumble of tracks approached, there was finally an answer waiting in the foxhole. Not a heavy gun, not distant artillery. A tube, a rocket, and a chance to fight back.
In February 1943, in the chaos of the fighting at Kasserine Pass, German forces overran several American positions. Equipment was abandoned in haste. Crates were left behind. Among the captured material were a handful of unfamiliar metal tubes, lightweight, shoulder-fired launchers, unlike any standard anti-tank weapon the Wehrmacht had previously encountered in Allied service. They were shipped to Berlin for evaluation. German ordnance engineers were not ignorant of shaped charge theory. In fact, Germany had already developed effective hollow charge warheads for specialized purposes. But what the captured American launcher demonstrated was something operationally disruptive, a practical, mass-producible, infantry-portable rocket system that required no heavy carriage and no complex deployment. The Germans studied it carefully. The U.S. M1 rocket launcher, already nicknamed the Bazooka, was simple by design: a steel tube, electrical ignition, a rocket with a shaped charge warhead. The backblast was dangerous, yes. The range was limited compared to anti-tank guns, but it gave ordinary infantry the power to penetrate tank armor without artillery support. German engineers moved quickly. By mid-1943, Germany fielded its own enlarged version, the Raketenpanzerbuchse, better known as the Panzerschreck. It featured a larger caliber rocket and eventually added a protective shield to protect the operator from blast and debris. It was powerful, in some respects even more potent than early American versions. On a technical level, Germany had answered the challenge. But warfare is not won at the prototype stage, it is won at scale. By the time Germany began producing the Panzerschreck in meaningful numbers, American industry had already accelerated bazooka production dramatically. Approximately 476,000 units would be manufactured during the war, at an average cost of about $25 per launcher. Rockets were produced in the millions. That number mattered more than any single battlefield encounter.
Every U.S. infantry division received them. Airborne units carried them into Sicily and later into Normandy. Armored infantry kept them ready against counterattacks. Marines in the Pacific used them against fortified positions and Japanese armor. Germany could produce effective anti-tank rockets, but Germany could not match the combined industrial capacity of the United States and its allies. Strategic bombing, resource shortages, and competing production demands constrained output. American factories, insulated by geography and fueled by vast raw materials, operated with expanding momentum. The mathematics of war were turning against the Panzer divisions. Blitzkrieg doctrine had been built on rapid armored thrusts exploiting weak points. In Poland and France, Allied infantry often lacked immediate, close-range anti-tank answers. German armor exploited that gap ruthlessly. Speed overwhelmed coordination. Shock collapsed morale. But by 1944, a German tank commander advancing into a European village faced a new tactical reality. Any window could conceal a bazooka team. Any hedgerow might hide a rocket launcher. Any rubble pile in a bombed-out town could become an ambush point. This did not make tanks obsolete. German armor remained lethal, especially in open terrain, but it forced a shift in tempo. Reconnaissance became more cautious. Infantry support for tanks became more essential. Urban advances slowed. The assumption that armor alone could punch through resistance without fear of close-range destruction was gone. German documents reflected this evolution. Training directives increasingly emphasized caution in the face of enemy infantry equipped with anti-tank rockets. Speed and shock tactics had to be adjusted. Armor could no longer assume psychological dominance at close quarters. And there was irony in the timeline. In Kasserine Pass, German forces had overrun American positions in part because U.S. anti-tank defenses were inadequate. Within months, the very weapon captured in that campaign was contributing to a broader strategic reversal. The Germans had recognized its value, but recognition did not erase the production gap. American doctrine adapted alongside production. Infantry were trained to coordinate rocket fire with small arms suppression. Engagement ranges were studied carefully. Crews learned to aim for side armor, rear plates, or vulnerable points near turrets and engine compartments. What began as a novel weapon became integrated into combined arms tactics. Industrial warfare magnified its effect. If a single launcher could destroy a tank, then 100,000 launchers could reshape battlefield assumptions. German armored divisions were powerful, but they were not infinite. Tanks required trained crews, fuel, spare parts, and time to replace losses. Each destroyed vehicle represented months of industrial effort and the loss of experienced personnel. The bazooka inverted the cost equation. A relatively inexpensive launcher and rocket could eliminate a machine that required immense industrial investment to build. This asymmetry eroded Germany's ability to sustain offensive armored operations at the tempo it had once mastered. Meanwhile, the American version continued to evolve. Improved rockets increased penetration. Later launcher models enhanced reliability. Training materials expanded. Units that had once received sealed crates without instruction now conducted structured drills. The imbalance of 1942 was no longer the imbalance of 1944. German armored commanders still relied on their tanks' firepower and armor thickness. Tigers and Panthers could dominate at long range. Their guns outranged most Allied tanks in many engagements. But close terrain, towns, forests, hedgerows, became increasingly to infantry armed with rockets. In those environments, heavy armor became vulnerable. The captured launchers from Tunisia gave Germany insight. They had sparked a domestic counterpart. But they also marked the moment when the logic of blitzkrieg encountered a new constraint, the democratization of anti-tank power. The battlefield was no longer divided cleanly between armored spearheads and helpless infantry. A 19-year-old private, properly positioned, could now threaten a multi-ton war machine, and that possibility changed how wars were fought. The shift was not instant. It did not erase German armor overnight, but it chipped away at its aura of invincibility. It forced doctrine to adapt. It slowed advances. It imposed caution where once there had been audacity. In industrial war, the side that scales innovation fastest gains the advantage. Germany had matched the idea. The United States had multiplied it. By the time Allied forces prepared for the invasions of Italy and France, the steel tube that began as an experiment became standard issue. The question was no longer whether American infantry could stop a tank. The question was how many tanks would risk advancing anyway.
By mid-1943, the rocket launcher was no longer an experiment. It was being shipped overseas in growing numbers. But invention and production are only two parts of warfare. The third is understanding, and at first, that understanding lagged behind. In one early logistical failure, thousands of launchers were delivered to combat zones sealed inside crates, with minimal training provided to the units receiving them. Some officers had never seen one fired. Some soldiers were unsure of effective range. Others underestimated the danger of backblast, firing too close to walls or from enclosed spaces. A revolutionary weapon had arrived, but doctrine had not fully caught up. Training accelerated quickly. Demonstrations were organized. Instruction manuals circulated. Soldiers learned the correct engagement distances, typically within 100 yards for best effect. They practiced aiming for side armor, rear engine compartments, and vulnerable turret rings. They learned that a steady nerve mattered as much as good aim. Because using a rocket launcher against a tank required something that could not be issued in a crate: the willingness to wait. The operator had to hold position while steel advanced toward him. He had to let the tank close to effective range. He had to expose himself long enough to fire, and sometimes long enough to reload. And yet, when it worked, it changed everything. In Sicily, in 1943, airborne and infantry units began using the bazooka in real combat conditions. The 82nd Airborne Division, deployed in a chaotic airborne operation, encountered German armored counterattacks. In broken terrain and tight villages, rocket teams found opportunities. The weapon was not flawless, but it proved that lightly equipped troops could threaten armored vehicles without heavy guns. Stories spread quickly through the ranks. A tank disabled from the side of a road, another struck near a stone farmhouse. The aura of invulnerability around German armor began to crack, not because tanks were suddenly weak, but because infantry were no longer powerless. Improvisation followed innovation. One of the more unusual adaptations involved a high school history teacher turned military officer who reportedly mounted multiple rocket launchers beneath the wings of a light fabric-covered observation aircraft. The idea was simple and audacious: approach from above, strike lightly armored targets, and withdraw before ground fire could respond effectively. It was not standard doctrine, and it was not widely adopted, but it demonstrated how flexible the weapon was. A device originally conceived for a foxhole could be adapted to the air. But the most powerful proof did not come from experiments. It came from individuals. In late 1944, during the brutal winter fighting in Europe, a 19-year-old American infantryman faced advancing German armor under extreme conditions. Snow covered the ground. Visibility was limited. Temperatures were punishing. German forces launched a determined armored push, confident in the shock value of their machines. The young soldier positioned himself carefully. He waited. One tank advanced into range. He fired. The shaped charge warhead struck and penetrated. The tank was disabled. Another followed. Again he fired. Again the armor failed to protect its crew. In rapid succession, he engaged multiple vehicles. 4 tanks were destroyed or disabled in a matter of moments. What once would have required artillery support or heavy anti-tank guns had been accomplished by a single determined infantryman with a shoulder-fired launcher. Medal of Honor citations from the European theater document similar acts of courage. Soldiers who held their fire until the last possible second, who engaged armor at dangerously close distances, who understood that if they failed, their unit might be overrun. The weapon did not eliminate fear, it demanded that fear be mastered. Tank crews felt the shift as well. Urban warfare and forest fighting became increasingly dangerous. Advancing past rubble piles or through narrow streets meant exposing vulnerable side armor to unseen threats. Infantry escorts became more cautious. Commanders hesitated before pushing armor unsupported into confined terrain. The bazooka altered behavior. Training matured as combat experience accumulated. Units learned to deploy rocket teams in pairs. One gunner, one loader, covering fire from riflemen, engagement from concealment rather than open confrontation. Tanks were strongest at range. Rockets were strongest up close. Infantry doctrine evolved accordingly. The psychological impact worked both ways. For American soldiers, the presence of a bazooka in the squad changed posture. It meant that when the rumble of engines echoed through trees or bounced off village walls, there was an option beyond retreat. Confidence grew not from invincibility, but from possibility. For German tank crews, uncertainty grew. A battlefield without clear anti-tank guns was once an invitation to press forward aggressively. Now, even when no heavy weapons were visible, danger might still be waiting within 100 yards. Speed slowed. Shock softened. By late 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied Europe, rocket launchers were standard tools of engagement. They were used in forests, in cities, along hedgerows, and in snow-covered fields. They were fired from upper stories of shattered buildings and from ditches along frozen roads. They were no longer experimental, they were expected. The sealed crates of 1943 had given way to seasoned crews who understood their weapon intimately. They knew its limitations, limited range, vulnerability to moisture in early models, the risk of backblast, but they also knew its strength, the ability to burn through armor that once inspired dread. The imbalance that had defined Kasserine Pass was not erased overnight, but by the winter battles in Europe, the American infantryman facing a tank was no longer defenseless. He still needed courage, he still needed discipline, he still needed support. But now, when steel approached through smoke and snow, he also carried a weapon that could stop it. By 1944, something fundamental had changed on the battlefield. German armored warfare had been built on momentum. Blitzkrieg was never just about tanks, it was about tempo. Tanks moved fast, struck hard, bypassed resistance, and shattered cohesion before defenders could react. Shock was the weapon, speed was the delivery system, confidence was the fuel. But confidence depends on superiority. In 1939 and 1940, German tank crews often advanced knowing that most enemy infantry lacked the means to destroy them at close range. Anti-tank guns had to be positioned carefully. Artillery had to be called in. If those elements failed or were bypassed, armor could dominate. By late 1944, that calculation no longer held. Now, as German forces faced Allied advances in Italy, France, and later inside Germany itself, nearly every American infantry platoon possessed rocket launchers. The bazooka was not rare, it was standard, it was expected, it was integrated into planning. Urban combat made this shift brutally clear. Bombed-out cities created landscapes of concealment, collapsed walls, shattered windows, twisted steel, and piles of masonry. In such terrain, long-range gunnery mattered less than short-range awareness. A heavy tank's thick frontal armor was optimized for open engagements, but side armor, rear compartments, and turret joints remained vulnerable to shaped charges.
German training directives increasingly emphasized caution. Tank crews were warned to avoid advancing without infantry support in close terrain. They were taught to scan rooftops and upper floors. They were instructed to assume that anti-tank rockets might be present even when no traditional guns were visible. This was not theoretical, it was a response to experience. A single rocket, properly placed, could disable a machine that required immense resources to produce. A Tiger or Panther tank represented skilled labor, strategic materials, complex manufacturing, and trained crew members. Losing one was not merely a tactical setback, it was an industrial and human loss that Germany could not easily replace by 1944. The economics of destruction had shifted. For roughly $25, an American squad possessed the means to threaten a vehicle worth tens of thousands in materials and labor. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of launchers in circulation, and the pressure on armored operations became constant. This did not mean tanks disappeared from the battlefield. German armor remained formidable. In open terrain, with proper support, it could still inflict severe damage, but the days of assuming that infantry would scatter helplessly were over. In Normandy's hedgerows, tanks advancing through narrow lanes encountered hidden rocket teams. In the forests of the Ardennes, armored thrusts met determined resistance from infantry who understood both the strengths and limits of their launchers. In Italian villages, rubble turned into ambush points. Every advance required calculation. Every street corner demanded caution. The psychological transformation was as significant as the physical one. For American infantry, the presence of a bazooka meant participation in the anti-armor fight. No longer entirely dependent on distant artillery or heavy guns, small units could shape engagements locally. They could deny roads, they could delay advances, they could protect their own positions with more than hope. For German crews, uncertainty replaced certainty. The battlefield became unpredictable at close quarters. Speed slowed, reconnaissance intensified, combined arms coordination became mandatory rather than optional. Blitzkrieg's original formula, rapid armored penetration exploiting weak anti-tank defenses, was no longer universally applicable. Captured German assessments reflected this adjustment. Tactical notes and training updates acknowledged the growing threat posed by Allied infantry anti-tank weapons. Shock tactics had to be modified. Unsupported armored thrusts in confined terrain carried unacceptable risk. The steel tube that began as a pragmatic American experiment became a doctrinal constraint for one of the most feared armored forces in the world, and its influence did not end in 1945. The basic concept, a shoulder-fired launcher delivering a shaped charge warhead, became foundational in post-war military design across the globe. Successive generations of anti-tank weapons refined range, penetration, and safety, but the principle remained the same: empower the individual soldier with the ability to defeat armor. The bazooka did not win the war alone. No single weapon did. Victory required logistics, air power, naval dominance, intelligence, and immense sacrifice. But at the tactical level, in foxholes and ruined streets, it corrected a dangerous imbalance that had once cost lives at Kasserine Pass. It restored equilibrium between steel and flesh. In 1941, an American infantryman hearing the rumble of tank tracks might have felt only dread. By 1944, he still felt fear. War guarantees that. But he also carried a response slung over his shoulder. A simple tube, a rocket, a shaped charge. Not elegant, not expensive, not complex, but enough to force even the most powerful armored force in Europe to slow down, to think twice, and to respect the men in the rubble. And in war, sometimes that shift from helplessness to agency is what changes everything.